Hey everyone, and welcome to the Private Podcast, where we plug in and explore the intersection of privacy, human rights, technology, and democracy. I'm your host, Derek E Silva. Today we're speaking with Jeremy Goldkorn. Jeremy is the editor-in-chief of SupChina. Sup or Soup?
Sup. Sup.
Okay, Sup.
Yeah.
SupChina, a New York-based China-focused news, information, and business services platform, and as co-host and co-founder of the I'm gonna say Seneca podcast because it's
Seneca
like
is how we usually
Sino
pronounce it,
Canadian
actually.
Seneca. Oh, okay,
Seneca, yeah.
all right. Well, yeah, that's okay. I was going based on the pronunciation of Sino, like Sino-American
Right.
relations or Sino-Canadian relations, but
Right.
that's cool. Jeremy, we had about 20 minutes worth of technical issues, but we're here, and thank you very much for taking the time to be on private today.
Thank you for having me.
Terrific. Let's get right into it. What is SupChina, and what are the key issues SupChina focuses on?
We're a media company. We report on China and everything in the world that China affects. We're based in New York. We have two editors in China, and the rest of the team is spread out around the world. We have a range of podcasts, including Seneca, which is our flagship podcast, and takes a deep dive into events, into matters kind of driving the news. It's not really a news show, but then we have a daily email newsletter, which I edit. And we have the website where we report breaking news and also publish feature stories, deeper dives into various topics from business and technology to culture and, obviously a lot of politics.
Yeah, certainly no shortage of politics to discuss in China, whether it's at the federal level or even at the city level. My understanding is mayors, city councils, or their equivalents actually have quite a bit of power, and so I'm sure there's no shortage of things to cover, even at the municipal level, I'll call it.
Exactly. Exactly.
Terrific.
It's you
What
can't
led
get
you to
away from
join
politics.
SupChina? Oh,
Well, I lived in
sorry.
China. I'll take that again. I lived in China for 20 years, from 1995 until 2015, and most of the time that I was there, I was working as an entrepreneur doing media projects, and as an editor and blogger sometimes. And when I moved to the United States, SupChina was just getting going, and it was a good fit for my experience and what I'm interested in, which is essentially I'm a news junkie fixated on China.
Fair enough. I could definitely see myself getting behind that sort of thing. That must have been a really interesting time, being there from '95 for the next two decades. That is really when a lot of this explosive growth happened. I know that kind of started in the '80s, but certainly in the '90s through the early 2000s, plenty of explosive growth, a lot of manufacturing moving over to China. Like, as a Westerner, but trying to start your own thing or do your own business in China, like, what was that like?
It was an amazing time. It was kind of like a crazy gold rush in many ways, with both Chinese people and companies, but also foreign companies and people hoping, to make fortunes. It was a time when it felt like pretty much anything was possible. People used to say about doing business in China, everything is difficult, but nothing is impossible, and it was a little bit like
Mm-hmm.
that. But I mean, the good times were kind of crazy good times. I mean, there was so much money sloshing about that it was just great to have a seat at the table and watch the goings on.
Sounds kind of like the dot-com boom, but maybe without the bust, or at least a much smaller bust before
I
booming
mean,
again.
right. We're sort of, if not, we're not going through a bust now, but the gloss is off, the bloom is off the rose. It's the growth has slowed down a lot, and in fact, many of the things that are going on in China right now are what you see is the government trying to figure out how to deal with a slower growth economy, and
Mm-hmm.
that's also part of the reason why some of the political and cultural possibilities that you saw in the first decade of the century, seem to really have gone away. There's certainly from the government's point of view, there's much less interest in opening up than there used to be.
Yeah, certainly. I'll just touch on this briefly. We don't need to deep dive, but I know, if you want to start something brand new now, at least depending on the sector, you need to partner up with a local Chinese firm. In at least in some cases, Apple, Facebook, tech companies that actually want to operate services, host data, you need to do that with a Chinese company, for example. I've seen lots of marketplaces. You need to partner up with a Chinese company, or else they're just not going to let you open, that sort of thing. So I guess that's one way of trying to boost local job development.
It is. I mean,
additional
in fact,
economic growth.
It's always been that way, really. For most industries, many industries at least, you've always had to work with a Chinese partner, and there are some, where those requirements, were taken away. Some of them quite some time ago, like early 2000s. It became, for example, possible to run an F&B, a restaurant without a Chinese partner. And now even you're seeing still some financial opening up in the financial sector. They're allowing wholly owned ventures for foreign companies. In auto, Tesla was the first foreign company to be allowed to have a wholly owned local factory. So, I mean,
Right.
to some extent, those requirements have always been there. There has, though, in the past been the sense that China was moving towards greater opening up now, whereas that's gone. You still see some Wall Street people, some big hedge funds and things talking about, the greater openness, and you do see some financial sectors opening up, but for most of the economy, it's just become a lot tougher to do business as a foreign company, and it might not necessarily be partnership requirements responsible for that.
Okay, cool, fair enough. Besides, with the issues I've brought up, what are some of the top trending stories on SupChina right now? Like, what sort of things are you guys covering that seems to be garnering the most attention?
Well, the biggest story this week has been Evergrande, which is this enormous real estate conglomerate, one of the biggest in China, that owes a lot of money to all kinds of investors and bondholders and has been in trouble for quite some time. But this week, particularly, there were 2 bond payments due. And it looks like they've probably resolved the short-term crisis, but it's unknown how they're going to fix this terrible debt problem that they have. It's a privately controlled company, and but there's a lot of government involvement in it, and it's becoming a test case to some extent for how the government is going to deal with companies like this that are in debt. And the question is it too big to fail? Will the government bail it out? And who will they bail out? Will they bail out the people who've bought apartments and paid for them and haven't been delivered yet? Or local small-time mom-and-pop investors? Probably, but will they bail out the foreign institutions that have lent Evergrande a lot of money? Probably not. So we're seeing this story play out this week, and it's really interesting. Just today, China basically extended its ban on Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency trading. They've been clamping down on it for quite some time, particularly in the last year, but today some new rules came out from the People's Bank of China, the central bank, basically making it illegal for even individuals to trade cryptocurrencies. You still, it's not illegal to own them, but you just can't buy or sell them anymore, basically. So this is really the last hammer in the nail of the crypto market in China, which the government has been trying to kill off for a while. Those are 2 big ones this week. I would say like a third one this week, also broke today actually, was HNA, another enormous privately controlled Chinese conglomerate with a lot of debt. They arrested the CEO and the chairman on unknown charges, possibly connected to spiraling debt. So it's yet another example of what has become a rather hostile environment for entrepreneurs over the last 6 months or so.
And then I guess on maybe you got covering it because she's here in North America, but Meng Wanzhou has
Of course.
reached a deal in order to resolve her criminal charges,
Oh no,
which
we
I'm particularly
absolutely.
interested in because she's in Vancouver. But and this was something like I saw a rumor on Apple News this morning, and I was like, oh, I'm just gonna go check real quick, and looks like that has in fact been, I guess, there's a settlement. I don't know the details yet, but
It seems so. It is
yeah.
absolutely something we cover and will do in detail, and it was an oversight not to mention it. The
Oh, no
only
problem.
news I've seen so far has been, wire reporting and newspaper reporting about it. It looks like there was a deal struck with the United States to return her. What is most distressing about it is that the two Canadian citizens that China basically kidnapped in retaliation for her arrest, Michael Spavo and Michael
Yeah.
Kovreg, who've been detained with no ability to see family or people from the embassy or lawyers in pretty awful circumstances. While Meng Wanzhou has been under house arrest in her palace in Vancouver. So these two Canadians are still, their fate is unknown. And, it was made pretty clear by a number of official statements that their arrest was a retaliation
Yeah.
for Meng Wanzhou's detention. So it looks like she's going to get out. It's unclear whether the two Canadians are going to get out or not.
Hmm. Yeah. I guess that remains to be seen. Um, I think it's kind of funny that we're seeing really large Chinese firms, privately or publicly controlled, doesn't really matter, end up in more or less the same issues a lot of Western companies, American companies, British companies, Canadian companies, and were in the late 2000s with like massive debts, no real plan to pay them off. Like, is this a theme of maybe where like money was really cheap? There was an impetus from the edicts, guidelines, wishes from the government to grow really quickly, and therefore these companies just took on way more than they could actually handle? Or is this more like we thought we were going to have a lot of growth, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, the growth has slowed, and so now we've got all this debt that we don't actually have the capital to pay off because we're not able to sell penthouse apartments to millionaires as quickly as we were a few years ago. Like, how did companies like Evergrande or Evergrande end up in this situation? Do you know?
I think it's a bit of both explanations and some others. On the one hand, there has been this extraordinary optimism about the Chinese economy, both inside China but also from foreign investors since the
Mm-hmm.
1990s, really, and particularly since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. And there has been this. This is the nation of 1.4 billion consumers allegedly, and half of them are still pretty poor, basically.
Yeah.
So there's been this sense that if the growth isn't infinite, there's still a long way to go. And this has been encouraged, by the government sometimes. It's been encouraged by entrepreneurs who want to inveigle other people into their into their business ventures, and the opacity of the Chinese government and Chinese economy has also contributed to it because it companies have been allowed to accumulate a lot of debt without a great deal of scrutiny, because the financial system and the regulators simply aren't very transparent. And then in the case of Evergrande, and to an extent H&A, the company whose two executives were arrested today, real estate, which has been one of the main drivers of China's economy over the last 30, 40 years, is an area that has been, it's rife with corruption in one way because most real estate fortunes were made because a developer is able to get a piece of land relatively cheaply from the government,
Mm-hmm.
and then develop it and build apartments which they resell, and
Right.
the margins have been pretty sick. And this has introduced a level of, if not criminality, certainly sketchiness of one kind or another into the whole industry. And this has been a very powerful driver of the Chinese economy. So, I mean, there's so many reasons why they're in debt. But yeah, I mean, essentially, optimism, the ability for developers to conduct a shell game, opportunistic business people, and a sense both in China and outside that the growth is, just like before the subprime crisis. People thought the growth couldn't stop, prices would keep on going up, and usually, I think always, that ends up causing pain.
Yeah, I hate to see other jurisdictions just kind of repeat the same mistakes. Certainly the United States, but other countries do too. Like Canadian banks were not immune or innocent in the subprime mortgage crisis a decade plus ago now. Neither were UK banks and some other European ones I recall being BNP Paribas, for example. Very large French bank, well capitalized, but lost a ton of money in that crisis. I just hate to see people repeat the exact same problems, or not put better stopgaps in place in order to prevent that from happening again. I know some rules in the U.S. regarding bank capitalization changed as a result, closer to what Canadian banks have, but I don't think it was personally. I don't think it was enough in order to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. And obviously, there are some investors who didn't learn the lesson well enough back in 08, 09. But what are you going to do?
Of course,
It's their money, right?
It's their money, and in some ways, it's timing. If your timing was good, even before the subprime crisis, you could make out like a bandit, and
Sure, yeah.
many of
Or if you
China's
bet
biggest
against it.
fortunes have been. Yeah, if you if your timing is right, again.
As some people did.
Yeah.
Um, are we kind of at a crescendo in terms of like the seriousness of some of the things coming out of China this year? Like, is this kind of like, oh my God, things can't possibly get any wilder or crazier, or do you think there will other be looking back so far? We still have a quarter left, but looking back so far at 2021, are these the biggest stories of the year, or are there other things that have already happened that you think are just cannot be topped, regardless of the fact that we got 3 months left?
I would never predict that the stories so far can't be topped. I mean, all kinds of things can happen. Uh, you know, at my most pessimistic, I would say war could break out in the Taiwan Strait. That would be
Or elsewhere. Yeah.
or elsewhere, but they're particularly. So no, I wouldn't like to make such a prediction. I think this Evergrande crisis is. It's not a Lehman Brothers moment. It's not 2008, global financial crisis redux. There's too many differences to make that a useful way of looking at it. But the story isn't over by any means, and there could still be trouble ahead. This year, the Chinese government has embarked on some extremely ambitious, regulatory reforms, you could call them, or crackdowns, on a variety of industries, technology particularly, and technology and finance. And many of these moves, I mean, they tend to be reported in Anglophone media and Western media as crackdowns and sort of what an authoritarian government does, and they are in many ways. Some of them are also things that a lot of people in the United States and Canada probably would like the government to do, like rein in the social media platforms, for example.
Right.
Try and make sure that the 1% aren't completely lording it over the rest of us peasants, and paying their fair share of taxes, and there's quite a lot that the Chinese government is trying to do that isn't just because they're horrible authoritarians. Nonetheless, the way they're going about it is unpredictable. It's not transparent. It's opaque, and
Right.
there is a political agenda behind a lot of it, and they are trying, it's Xi Jinping really, who has become the all-powerful leader with a, incipient personality cult. I mean, Xi Jinping is trying to transform the Chinese economy. So many things could go wrong.
What's on the horizon for SupChina? What do you guys have planned for the rest of this year for the and for 2022 that you can share with us? Growing the team, growing the
Uh,
coverage, maybe adding more people in China. You only have two there right now. I know that's potentially a precarious
Possibly,
situation
yeah.
for those folks, but
Yeah, China. It's kind of tough. I mean, the environment. We're not going to be having anyone doing political news based in China, but we're growing our business coverage at the moment. We're launching. It's live already, but in beta, a database of Chinese companies called Edge, which basically aims to be a comprehensive archive of information about all kinds of Chinese companies, big to small, with basic background information on what they are, what they do, and other stuff potentially useful given the current climate, like do they have ties to the military or not, some information about their investors. So this is one thing we're working on that's just launched, and we're going to be putting a lot more energy into it in the coming months. We're also considering expanding to Chinese language media, which would be is a whole different ball game and could be very interesting.
yeah, terrific. That sounds exciting. What about Seneca? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, the podcast has been going actually for 10 years. It started before SupChina. And I'm a co host, although recently not that frequently. And I produce it together with a guy named Kaiser Guo, who we're old friends from living in Beijing. He's an
Hmm.
American Chinese, but also lived in China for 20 plus years. And the show is we interview authors, a lot of journalists and writers, people who write books about China, political leaders, and sometimes business people. So we're going to keep on doing that. It's only getting more interesting in some ways, and the situation in China is changing so fast that it feels like more necessary than it's ever been, because typically the mainstream news media will only really cover China. I mean, there are three main stories Anglophone media is interested in. There's like big China, when huge things happen, bad China or scary China when China does nasty totalitarian things, and then weird China, there's some story about a sex doll factory or something like that. Those are basically the three types of stories that you tend to see in on the daily news or in the newspapers in Canada or the United States.
Yeah.
And the trouble is, I mean, this is a very important country that's going to affect everybody's future around the world, and if you only get those three types of stories, you get pretty misled. So our aim is to try and counteract that and
Yeah.
tell a fuller story.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you're a bit of a news junkie. I was at one point. I don't have time to be anymore, unfortunately. But I'm one of those people who's been reading Foreign Policy magazine, and we had somebody on from restofworld.org a little while ago. SupChina and Seneca, like these for me, like I want the deep dive. My family is from Portugal. I was actually listening to a Portuguese daily news podcast for a little while because I actually wanted to know what was going on from an actual local perspective, as opposed to waiting for the big stories to hit or watching a
Right.
Canadian Portuguese language daily broadcast. A, because I can't get it right now because I don't have the channel, I don't have cable TV, and B, just it's got to be at that time. There's no recording or anything like that I can watch or listen to at my own leisure. So for me, like the sort of coverage you're doing, really on the ground and deep diving and going way beyond, the headline news is I think really important, especially for people who do want to understand, the historical tension for why Taiwan and China don't get along and why it's called Chinese Taipei when they go to the Olympics, and and how that even happened. And I got some additional context listening to um, the Hardcore History podcast. Dan Carlin, he covered the Eastern
Right.
Theater of World War II in like 20 hours of coverage, maybe 25 for 5 or 6 episodes. And I just, because it doesn't come up in school, and I didn't bother look it up myself. I didn't understand how Taiwan came to be, and so I got a lot more context there of the fact that there was basically a civil war after World War II, and why this divide, or how that divide happened, and why therefore mainland China thinks that Taiwan, Chinese Taipei, belongs to them, and all this other stuff. So it was for me, I love that sort of stuff, and so the more context I get for a country that I'm probably not allowed to go to, um, because of things I've said online publicly in the past, and stances I've taken. It's still really interesting to know about, because, as you said, I do have a very strong sense as well that they already have a big impact in the world, maybe oversized, but certainly huge now, and they want to play an even larger role. The Belt and Road Initiative is not going away. The issue with the Taiwanese Strait and Taiwan is certainly not going away, and I'm sure that they have even larger ambitions. That the government at least has even larger ambitions beyond that. So yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so you've been doing the podcast for over 10 years now, which is impressive, because not too many podcasts can say that they've been around for that long. Can you name a favorite or a couple of favorites, whether maybe it was an interview you did, or covering a story on the podcast?
I'll name one actually. Just it's a very recent one. We just did it last week. Was we called it the Red New Deal, and it's basically with two people who really know their subject matter, Lizzie Lee and a scholar named Jude Blanchette, and it's about the crackdowns and regulatory reforms that are going on in China right now, and it's a good way to get up to speed on what's going on and kind of understand the context behind it. And we go into it at some depth. So if you're looking for more context and sort of a more complete way of understanding what's going on than you'd get in a typical news report, I would recommend it.
Terrific. That sounds like a great place to start, and maybe start going through the back catalog a little bit for additional context. The Red New Teal. Just,
I mean,
well done.
on top of that one, I'd probably recommend the very first one we did in April 2010, just after Google announced they were pulling out of China.
Oh, wow.
Which was, in some ways, it was the end of, it was 2010. It was very much the end of the 2010s, and it was sort of the beginning of the China that we're seeing now in some ways. And it was the end of optimism for many people who thought that China might go a different path.
Yeah, yeah. Heaven forbid we learn about Tiananmen Square 40 plus years later. Speaking of this is a great segue. Speaking of the China that we know now, and a lot of the regulatory changes that they've made this year, they've actually recently passed one of what some might call the strictest data privacy law. I know they've restricted. You talked about the crackdown on tech apps and finance apps. Some of those companies actually intersect, right? Like Alibaba with Alipay and AliExpress, and their financial arm, Ant Financial. How do you think? How do you think this is going to, or maybe do you know how this is affecting Chinese citizens, people who were already interacting with WeChat, Alipay, Ant Financial, and some of these other services?
Well, the data, I mean, the privacy and data laws that they've passed are one part of the Red New Deal, this series of crackdowns that we've been talking about. It maybe is a little too early to say, what the direct effect on ordinary consumers will be. I would say that a lot of ordinary Chinese people are not unhappy and maybe even quite happy with some of the direction of some of these crackdowns, because there is very much a feeling that the powerful tech companies, particularly Alibaba and then Tencent, which basically control the mobile money in China, as well as social networks, e-commerce, and all kinds of things. These two companies in particular, and others like Meituan and JD, which do e-commerce, there's a sense that they're too powerful and that they're abusing their power to profit off consumers. So it's many of the new rules are in theory supposed to protect consumers, and some of them will, and a lot of consumers are going to be happy if there's some power taken away from the internet companies, but we'll see what it looks like in practice. Some of it is bound to go wrong.
I'm sure some of it will go wrong. I have yet to see a large, wide-ranging regulation like this not have any unintended consequences. I think that's just kind of the rule. Now, hopefully they fix it, fairly quickly if that's the case. But maybe my understanding is wrong here. Don't those same new data privacy regulations, restricting the ability for WeChat, Alipay, etc., to collect and analyze a ton of data, doesn't also give or make those companies give more data back to the CPC or to the the PRC, the Communist Party, or the government?
You can call it the CPC or
it's
CCP.
Pretty much the same thing. So
it is. They prefer CPC.
Okay.
Whatever. The Communist Party. Yes, absolutely. I mean, a big part of what they're doing with these regulations is self-seeking, making sure that everybody understands that the Communist Party is the leader of the country, making sure that the internet companies actually, aren't too powerful to deal with, that the internet companies aren't the ones deciding on what should be censored and what, that it's the party making those decisions. The party is going to suck up any and all data it can, whatever the and they may be very genuinely good intentions, but whatever the good intentions behind many of these rules are, they will all be accompanied by some type of power grab by the party, or a reassertion of party dominance over business and economic and social and political life.
Interesting. Certainly glad that my birth lottery didn't land me in China. So the Chinese Communist Party, or the Chinese Communist Party, obviously has access to a ton of data. We've heard for a couple of decades now, I think, about this social credit system that has been slowly rolling out, piece by piece over the last, I think, decade or so. Like, what are these new regulations going to impact that? How is that system actually working in practice right now? Are there fans of it? Are there any detractors of it? What does that situation look like at the moment?
Yeah, I think that the social credit system is one of those things that gets, if not misreported, it gets misunderstood because the Anglophone media tends to only focus on one side of it, which is the possibility of it being used for repressive ends.
Right.
And, as I just said, of course, anything the Chinese Communist Party does is going to partly be used for repressive ends. That's pretty much a given. But most of what the social credit system is supposed to do is not very different from the credit rating system in the United States. And, I'm a new immigrant here, and I was shocked to discover both how necessary it is to have a credit rating if you want to do various financial things, but how much data, private data of mine, gets end up, if not the public domain, it's very much for sale to anyone with the right excuse and the money to buy it. And that my credit rating can really significantly affect my life in many different ways. If I have a very bad credit rating, I may have reduced access to all kinds of what in other countries one might call social services. So I think that the sort of fears about the social credit system are in some ways overhyped, and that probably a better way to think of it is like the American credit rating system. And I believe you have something similar in Canada.
Oh yeah.
But it's a way that society and companies can figure out who's a good credit risk and who's not. And that is something that if you want to have an economy where things happen on credit, you need. Of course, there is another component to it. Of course, it will be used for repression. But I think of all the things one has to worry about being used for repression in China, this would not make it onto my list of top 5 concerns.
Okay, fair enough. I could have sworn I've heard stories of people not being able to buy bus tickets or train tickets because they have a poor social credit score system. And like for me, that would never happen. Like Via Rail cannot deny me access to the train as long as I can pay for a ticket, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean,
Okay.
it's going to be used in ways that may not feel right to us. I mean, I would say that the other thing to understand is that the system isn't, one thinks of this highly efficient sort of technocratic, totalitarian state knows who you are and will, stop you from doing anything. But the reality is that it's still a patchwork.
Right.
And it's not as efficiently totalitarian as it's sometimes made out to be.
Not yet.
That said, it's going to get better. The system is going to get better, or for the ordinary person, worse.
Yeah, yeah. Like that depends on your
I'm not saying
definition
it's
of
not
better.
something one should worry about, but yeah, it's not something one shouldn't worry about. But I think in terms of worries, there are many other things the Chinese government are doing that perhaps are more urgently needed to worry about.
What name 2? Like for me as a normal
example,
person who the credit scoring system in the US and Canada isn't great. It's certainly not amazing. There are lots of improvements that could be made. I have all sorts of funds on chain now that are not counted towards my ability to do things in real life, even though I could sell it all, convert it to fiat currency, and suddenly bring, I don't know, high 5 figures into my traditional non-digital life. But that sort of stuff's not counted. Okay, I can more or less deal with that. But my ability to do stuff like normal everyday activities is not impacted. So I'm just from a civil liberties perspective, I think that's pretty huge. Besides the data being hoovered up by the Chinese Communist Party, so I'm just curious, like what are the other things that the Chinese government is doing that you think are maybe Chinese citizens are far more concerned about or should be concerned about?
Well, most Chinese citizens aren't concerned about this, but the Uyghur ethnic group in the Xinjiang region,
Of course.
Large numbers of them, are more than 1 million, judging from most, authoritative reports, are being detained in effectively concentration camps.
Yeah.
This, I would say, is perhaps the biggest worry in terms of civil liberties in China. But aside from that, I mean, the Chinese government has so many ways of restricting people's civil liberties that the social credit system is not being used that much. Whereas, for example, censorship, the Chinese internet is, aside from the Great Firewall, which blocks off, most of the foreign internet by this point, inside China, everything is micromanaged in terms of, anything that could have the faintest type of, political risk to it for the government. So, and that is something that people notice because, sometimes, things happen. Somebody, a medical student can't get access to a foreign website that has information that they need because they're trying to research, one example of, countless.
Sure.
So I would say that, the ruthless censorship, the fact that, what was a sort of emerging civil society in the 2000s has pretty much been destroyed by arresting its key figures and making it illegal. So, NGOs, lawyers who used to provide services for people, they call them rights lawyers in China, defending people against, unjust seizure of their property by real estate developers. This kind of person is no longer allowed to operate. So, in terms of civil liberties, there's a long list of things.
Unfortunately, including this recent restriction or additional restriction on like how many games or how many hours of games I think adults, but now especially children, can play per week. I'm not a fan of just letting your kid play.
The new rule is focused on under 18s.
Yeah, like I've got kids. I don't let them play video games uninhibited, but like it's like 3 hours per week. Man, that's basically what I let my kids do on the weekend, and like, so I try to top it up for myself, but that's my own personal choice. That's not the Canadian government saying your kid can only play video games for 3 hours a week. Like, what's the reaction in China when things like that come down? Whether it's adults, the amount of time adults are allowed to spend doing leisure activities like this, or now children.
Well, I mean, often the attitude is a result of sort of passive acceptance. If one bears in mind that until about the 1990s, most Chinese people's lives were pretty awful. Not enough food really for much of the previous century, really. Just on a most basic level. So, to a large extent, as long as people's living standards keep on going up, and they have been going up quite dramatically in the last, few decades, they're willing to put up with a lot of stuff from the government, a lot of interference in their daily lives. And there's a lot less interference in their daily lives now than there was before the 1980s, when, your life from, even you needed permission from your work unit to get married, and, everything in your life was controlled by the state. The state has removed itself from many aspects of people's personal lives, people are coming at it from the other end than the average Canadian or American. Sure. Things are better now, even from a civil liberties perspective. For the most ordinary people, they feel as though things are better than their parents had it. Some things actually seem to be quite popular. I mean, like the gaming rules, a lot of parents were quite pleased about, because
well, if I can't do it, the government's going to do it. So, ha.
Yeah, exactly. And they're trying to make it really happen, because they're the real name registration requirements and this kind of thing. It's right. Going to make it not impossible, but more difficult for kids to get around the system. So, some things like this, people are actually quite happy about. Some things people tend to passively accept, and think that, as long as most parts of their life, materially, things are getting better, they're prepared to put up with, a much lower, much more restrictive rules on their civil liberties.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point you just made in terms of like their lives are still improving overall, in compare, whereas you and I are coming, despite the fact you spent 2 decades there, you sound British, and therefore I can make
I'm
some
from South
assumptions.
Africa originally,
Are you
but
fr- Okay, all right. Well, then never
yeah.
mind. Okay, so I'll speak only for myself then. um, uh, I grew up in a certain way where I've had all sorts of freedom, and for the government to take away at least certain freedoms, I'd be pissed, like plain and simple. Like, and there are certain things where I would be out picketing, protesting, etc. There are lots of things I'm not, just because, and this just doesn't happen very much, so I haven't really been tested in that way. But I'm like, have you ever had a conversation with somebody living in China now or a former Chinese person about like how much they're willing to put up with, how much interference they're willing to put up with before some sort of revolution actually occurs, like a grassroots protests in China as opposed to Hong Kong, which we saw fairly recently as well, because they have enjoyed extraordinary freedoms since the British left, and now that's being restricted.
Yeah, I have. I mean, that's something that I've always been interested in is, how do Chinese people see the way Westerners see, freedom and civil liberties.
Hmm.
And they certainly, I mean, the culture is the base culture is very different. Even aside from the Communist Party, before the Communist Party were around, China didn't have an enlightenment, and it is. I mean, it's kind of a cliche about Confucianist societies, but I mean, there's no question that the culture is less focused on the rights of the individual,
Hmm.
and that a lot of people are, if not in sync with the state, their immediate reaction to restrictions on civil liberties is not necessarily a typical North American reaction, and people are in fact prepared to uh, put up with a much more paternalistic government that from a Canadian or American point of view you'd feel they're interfering in your personal life and your personal freedoms. People are much more willing to put up with that for sure, but not everybody. And I think one of the reasons why China remains, to some extent fragile is that, a lot of Chinese people, they may be willing to put up with it, but if they can, they'll put their money abroad. They'll invest it abroad. If they can, they'll send their kid to college, abroad.
Hmm.
There's a certain sense of, a lack of a sense of security about living in China that a lot of people have. And I think that's sort of where it's almost, you don't see the reaction so much as a reaction on principle that I object to this reduction in my freedoms and I'm going to go to the barricades and demonstrate about it. Maybe not, but maybe I'll send my kid to college in Canada, and while they're there, buy a house there and
Yeah.
try and stay long enough to get them a green card or a passport. And I think that's where society and the country pays for the repression. The chance of a kind of a new revolution, at least right now in China, seems pretty slim to me.
Yeah, I've actually seen that scenario you just mentioned play out. I worked with a woman at a digital agency before I started working with Orchid, and in the cryptocurrency space full time, who her parents moved here, bought up a few properties, rented them out, basically, started a very small real estate empire. Basically, more or less what they were doing, by the sounds of it, back home in China as well. And their daughter moved here, went to college, and eventually got her citizenship, which means that my understanding, China doesn't allow you to have dual sort of citizenship. So she actually renounced her Chinese
Yeah.
citizenship, and she's taken on Canadian only. And that's a bright, maybe not wealthy, but well-to-do family, and who are educated, and instead, the Chinese populace, the Chinese, the nation of China is losing them instead. So I guess engaging in the law of 2 feet, if you can afford it, is certainly one way to show, your unhappiness with where you're living. So That was a
Yeah.
very somber note. I want to end on a silly note because we've gone a little bit over time, and we've also got a little long here too because I could do this for another hour, but I don't think my producer would be happy with that. I'd rather end on a silly note and just ask. Earlier this week, I heard that the IT ministry of Lithuania basically told all Lithuanians to throw their Huawei phones away because Huawei or Xiaomi, one or the other, because there was a
I think
piece
there were.
of
I think they said any Chinese phones.
any
Yeah,
Chinese phone, yes,
Xiaomi
but
was mentioned in some of the reports. Yeah.
in this expanding investigation into the Pegasus spyware, they also happened upon a piece of software in Android that Chinese manufacturers, I'm pretty sure, need to have, at least in China, that censor certain words. Right? You can't write Tiananmen Square on a Xiaomi phone in China. It's not going to let you send the message, or it's not going to. You hit like in WeChat now. If I sent that in WeChat to somebody in China, I'm 100% certain the message would not get through because I know that that's an issue. Citizen Lab, which is based in University of Toronto, has reported on. Did that story make it to China? If so, what was the reaction? Or you and your cohorts at SupChina, when you see stuff like that happen, like how do you guys react?
I didn't see any Chinese language coverage of that story actually.
Not that surprised.
I mean, there may have been in overseas Chinese websites, but no, I didn't see any coverage of that story. I mean, yeah, that's hardly surprising. I
Yeah.
mean, I wouldn't use a Chinese brand phone, although I mean, my iPhone was made in China,
Yeah.
so it's not that everything made there is necessarily sketchy, or maybe it is, and we don't know. But yeah, it's totally unsurprising.
Um, and
It's totally unsurprising that it.
yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you here. We've got a small
No,
bit
no, no,
of
I'm done.
of a delay.
Go ahead.
I guess actually one last question. The South China Morning Post, is that kind of like SupChina where it's operating outside the outside China and it's reporting on it, or is that actually uh, um, a government run news agency?
No, it's not. I mean, it's based in Hong Kong. It's an
Okay.
old Hong Kong newspaper. The Jack Ma, the Alibaba guy, basically one of his companies bought it
Ah.
a few years ago. So it is controlled by a mainland entity, but it's not controlled directly by the government. Um, so they will no doubt be, I mean, the editorial has been changing for years, and the previous owners were a very a big real estate family, the Kwok family, Malaysian, Chinese, Hong Kong real estate empire. And under their ownership, the editorial line of the South China Morning Post had already started to get quite a lot more sympathetic towards the Communist Party.
Okay.
And that's been happening. They still do some interesting reporting on China. I don't think that's going to last that much longer, though. I suspect that Jack Ma is going to be forced to sell the South China Morning Post to a Chinese government entity at some point, and that'll truly be the end of it.
Good. Thank you for that context, because that for me that's kind of hard to get without knowing the right people to ask. So instead, I'll start reading SupChina.
Okay, good. Well,
So
thank you,
so
Derek.
I will plug it for you. Supchina.com, supchina.com. Jeremy, thanks so much for rescheduling, for getting through the technical issues that thankfully hopefully nobody will see, but and for spending some time with us on this beautiful Friday afternoon.
Thank you very much, Derek. It was a pleasure.
Terrific. Everybody, thank you again for listening, and until next time, stay free.